Hello and welcome back. This is the fourth in our series on ag leasing from the University of Missouri Extension. With me today is Rachel Hopkins, who is going to talk to you about cash land leases. I'm Julie Harker with Kaffner Extension News, and I'm happy to be your host this evening with Rachel. And wanted to remind you, as always, we will welcome your questions and would love to have you type them into the chat box at any time. And at the end, Rachel will be able to answer those for you. Also, mute yourselves so that we have the best audio possible as this is being recorded. And that's at the bottom left of your screen. So, Rachel, tell everyone about yourself and what you're going to talk about today.
Of course. Thank you for having me here tonight, Julie. It is great to be up here in Columbia this evening. Hello, everyone. I'm Rachel Hopkins. I'm an ag business specialist based out of Potosi in Washington County. If you haven't heard of Potosi before, don't be surprised. It's about an hour and a half southwest of St. Louis. I've been with Extension in this role as going on 7 years, a little over 7 years now. And my father and I, we have a cow-calf operation and a general cattle operation in southern Crawford County. I see a large number of lease questions in my role during the year, and I also enjoy working with producers in QuickBooks and helping them with financial problems as well. A fair amount of questions that I hear about arise from misunderstandings between landowners and tenants.
Why are there so many misunderstandings?
So a lot of these misunderstandings, they just arise due to not having a written contract and miscommunication. So the vast majority of farmers do not have written contracts, which has caused some problems for both tenants and landlords. Some landowners have been soured on leasing ground due to not having a written contract and thinking that tenants are not following what was originally agreed to. While in essence, the landowner may have forgot what was agreed to, or both parties could be just forgetting, misinterpreting, or not having what is clearly spelled out.
So besides that written lease, what other tips would prevent these kinds of misunderstandings in cash leases?
So the biggest tip I have is good, timely communication. And that goes both ways, not just, it's not a one-way street. If a landowner wants to see the farm go in a different direction, communicate that early to the tenant, not when they are receiving the check. Also remember that the direction that the landowner might want might require concessions on their part. This is vice versa for the tenant as well. If the tenant wants to go a different direction in the farm, communicate that early with the landowner with clear goals and clear objectives. Most issues, but not all, could have been solved with better communication from both parties early on.
What are other questions that you get a lot, when it comes to cash land leases?
So rental rates are the big one I receive. I'll get 2 to 3 every single week. I often get questions about what should be charged or what should be paid for a piece of ground. This can kind of get sticky sometimes because if you get 2 call-ins from the same area, you're wondering, well, am I getting played on both sides here? So you have to be very careful on how you answer those and not just give a number. It is a very difficult question to answer because there are so many factors that are involved in rental rates and what goes into those rates. It's just not a clear-cut line.
Well, in that vein, let's look at this first video that we have. It's from the landowner perspective, and it'll give us information on how to determine rental rate.
A property owner has several objectives when leasing their property. They want income for a living. They may want to preserve the land for others and to benefit their community. To meet their objectives, they typically need to cover all the expenses associated with owning property. They also want to receive a desired return on their investment. Landowners can receive 2 types of return from leased land: annual cash rental rate and capital gains. The lease rate less expenses plus the capital gains is the total return to the land. Understanding annual returns and capital gains can help a property owner estimate the lease rate she would like to be paid. Capital gain is measured by how much the land appreciates over time. Average land values in Missouri have increased from $1,200 per acre in 2000 to $4,200 per acre in 2022. Land values increased in most years, but decreased in some years. Over time, Missouri land values have appreciated 5.7% per year. Rental payments are the annual return to property ownership. According to the USDA, Missouri annual rent-to-land value decreased between 2009 and 2022 from 4.5% to 3.5%. However, the 3.5% of land value rental payment that landowners receive is not all a return to ownership. They must pay ownership expenses from the rental payment. The rental rate is not a fixed percentage of land value. It is a decision of the landowner. While 3.5% was the average in 2022, an individual landowner may charge more or less than that amount, depending on her objectives for land ownership. The rental rate charged to a tenant needs to cover all the costs of owning the rented property. So, it's appropriate to first list ownership costs when determining cash rental rates. Property owners almost always pay taxes and insurance on their property. They may also have expenses associated with land improvements, such as tiling or terracing. To these costs of owning property, the landowner needs to add their desired annual return on investment in the property. This desired annual return is in addition to any expected capital gains on the property. The landowner's desired annual return is calculated by listing the value of the land, the desired return on the land, and the expenses associated with the land. The sum of the desired annual return and the costs of ownership is the starting point for negotiating a rental rate on the property. In this example, the property owner would like to receive a 3% annual return on her investment in land and pay the ownership costs of property tax, insurance, and terracing. This totals $190 per acre in this example. Listing the costs of owning property does not determine the rent. It outlines the landowner's contribution to the farming activity and helps her understand her financial objectives. She can use this summary to explain her needs and objectives to the tenant when negotiating the rental rate. At this time, it might be useful for the property owner to compare her desired rental rate with rental rates published by the USDA or their extension service. This comparison helps the property owner determine if her desired rental rate is realistic. The landowner should also review all her objectives of owning property. These may impact negotiations with possible tenants. Some landowners charge lower rates to help beginning farmers or family members. Some insist on certain production activities that increase the contribution of the tenant and perhaps lower what they receive in rent. The tenant may bargain for a lower rental rate. Reconciling the difference between what the landowner wants and what the tenant is willing to pay requires negotiation. During negotiation, the property owner may lower her desired return on investment or opt to receive compensation other than rent payments. She may require the tenant to repair fences, maintain grassed waterways, or plant cover crops. These non-cash tenant contributions may lower the actual cash rent received while still meeting the desired rate of return on the land. Landowners are better prepared to discuss rental rates with the tenant when they know their objectives, their costs, and their desired rates of return around which they can negotiate.
So in that video, they talked about insurance as something that the landowner needs to pay. What about the tenant?
So yes, the tenant, it is imperative that they have insurance as well. Renters should also carry insurance on rented ground. If their equipment is stolen, cattle get out, get hit by a car, do damage to someone's yard or something else, a tenant worker gets hurt while working on the property it happened on should be listed on the tenant's policy. An example of this is our own personal story. Back in 2014, we had some ground rented and we had a baler up there. Well, the baler was stolen one night. So the ground and the baler were both listed on our insurance policy. and therefore our insurance carrier covered the loss. If that rented ground would not have been covered, they may not have covered that baler being stolen. So it is very important that you review your insurance policies with your agent periodically, make sure everything is up to date, and that all your rented equipment or ground is listed. Always check with your insurance carrier to see what specifically they need to cover losses or accidents. But swinging back to the landlord carrying liability, they should verify that the tenant is carrying the insurance. Utilizing a written contract, it's a great way to make it known that insurance is expected. The landowner can ask for proof of insurance. In today's world, you can never have too much insurance, especially with the price of everything. Talk to your insurance agent up front, as it's easier to have these conversations before a bad situation happens. By taking care of this, you can alleviate problems and create a better communication with all involved parties.
What about the importance of non-cash compensations in lieu of higher rent?
Yeah, so non-cash contributions in lieu of rent, they are extremely important. And in reality, the landowner, they can get some pretty great things out of it, that they don't have to front the money for it, and it helps keep their property value up as well. So just a quick example, let's say there is a 2-mile road coming in. A non-cash contribution would be that the tenant grades the road and puts 1 load of rock on each year. So by doing that, the landowner keeps accessibility to the property, therefore keeping the property value up. He or she is easier able to access the property, and it's costing them less versus if they would have just charged for rent.
What about something like fencing?
So fencing is another great example of the landowner getting a non-cash contribution. Fencing is very expensive. And so if a tenant goes in there, builds a new fence, they've got labor, they've got high-priced materials, they've got a lot of time, they're going to probably want a 5 to 7 year lease on that to get their money back out of it. Even though the landowner is locking that in, what they're getting out of it is an improved value of that ground due to that new fence. If that tenant has to go in there and fix a bunch of old fence, it's still keeping that property value up. So even though they're not getting cash for it, they're getting ahead in the long run, the landowner is, by taking those non-cash contributions. And it can take the form of many things: bush hogging, trimming trees, maybe some spraying in different areas. Really, the sky's the limit in creativity, just as long as both parties agree to it.
So let's have you talk about capital gains. Property owners get the capital gains and an annual return. So explain to us exactly what is capital gains and how it's important for landowners.
Yeah, so capital gains is simply an increase in value that occurs from the time an asset is bought until it is sold. Land has historically increased over time. The annual return or rent is usually not enough to incentivize people to own ground. So they count on the capital gains from holding the ground for years before the sale. The challenge to this is that the capital gains doesn't provide immediate cash until the ground is sold. To get the annual return, the ground might be rented in the meantime to cover expenses.
So it seems the 3 to 3.5% annual return keeps coming up. Is that the norm?
So no, it's simply an average. So think of buckets: 1 foot in a hot bucket of water, 1 foot in a bucket of cold water, and that's average. So as you travel across the state, annual returns, they vary. Down by me in the Ozarks, there's instances of less than 1% of what ground's rented for, dependent on the ground, the location, and the production. Ground use plays a major role in this. Crop ground obviously is going to bring more than good hay ground or marginal pasture ground. So the ground use plays a role. Production is another player in this. Good pasture ground is going to command a higher price than marginal or poor pasture ground. Same thing for hay ground. Does it need a lot of lime? Does it need a lot of fertilizer? Has it had issues in the past? It's important for landowners to keep this in mind when formulating what they'd like to charge. If they've got ground north of the Missouri River and south of the Missouri River, they're probably not going to get the same rates for both. So keep that in mind. Once again, non-cash contributions play a huge role in what is charged, and landowners shouldn't overlook the relationships and what the value of that is. An example of this is if they've got a cabin or a house on a piece of property and they got a tenant there renting the ground. If they can call, text, or email that tenant and say, hey, I need you to open the gate to let the propane guy in, or I've got someone coming to work on the electric, or can you, my security system came on. Can you go check, see if anyone's there? What value is that to you? And if that landowner lives 2, 3, 4 hours away, having a tenant that will do that can provide a lot of value. And don't expect that with every tenant. So really consider that in those negotiations. Do you have a good tenant and do you want to lose them?
Very good. Well, let's look at this next video, and it does explain the tenant perspective in a cash lease.
Farming tenants want to make a profit from producing agricultural commodities. Tenants may have other objectives, such as raising a family and helping society. To accomplish any of their objectives, their revenue must exceed all their costs, including the cost of renting property. There are several steps for determining leased property arrangements. The tenant first calculates their contribution to the production process, then studies published rental rates, makes an offer, and negotiates with the property owner to arrive at a mutually satisfying agreement. The first step for a tenant determining how much to pay for leased property is to create a budget detailing all revenues and costs. Most university extension divisions, including MU Extension, publish costs of production every year for major crops grown in that state. These are a great place to start when developing a workable rental agreement. Published cost of production estimates are for a representative farm in the state. It does not give the costs of production for any one farm. MU Extension publishes these budgets in spreadsheets that farmers can modify to reflect their actual inputs and prices paid. In a cash lease, the tenant is normally responsible for all operating costs, such as seed, fertilizer, chemicals, insurance, and fuel. The quantity of each input used times the price paid is the tenant's contribution to production. The tenant also contributes the ownership costs of machinery and general business overhead. Machinery ownership costs per acre change with the number of acres farmed. Machinery ownership costs per acre might decrease for a tenant adding acreage to his farm if he's able to farm the additional land without adding more machinery. When calculating how much to pay for rent, use current per acre costs of owning equipment. Since machinery ownership costs per acre may be reduced by adding more land, tenants might use cost savings to offer the landowner a more attractive lease rate. The farming tenant's contribution is the sum of all operating costs and the ownership costs of any owned asset used in production. Many extension budgets put a real estate charge, or what might be paid as a fixed cash rent, in the ownership cost section of a budget. However, rent is the property owner's contribution, not the tenant's contribution. A reasonable real estate charge is settled by bidding and negotiation. Estimating expected revenue, should the tenant obtain the property, helps determine a potential reasonable real estate charge. Subtracting tenant contributions from expected revenue estimates the return to land and management. The return to land and management will be allocated to either land, an amount paid to the landowner as a lease, or management, an amount retained by the farming tenant as compensation for his work. The more that goes to land in the form of rent, the less that goes to management, and vice versa. The USDA and many universities publish the results of cash rental rate surveys. These surveys estimate what a tenant might expect to pay in rent. Cash rental rate surveys don't report specific rental rates at which tenants can make a satisfactory return on their management. The negotiation process is an effort to obtain the land at a rate that fairly recognizes the tenant's managerial contribution to production. Tenants may show this worksheet to the landowner to justify their rental rate offer. Negotiation requires the tenant to consider what the property owner wants, know the lease rate he can pay to obtain his desired return to management, and then arriving at a rate linking the desired outcomes of both tenant and owner.
All right, looks like we do have a couple of questions in the chat box. Keep them coming and we'll get to those at the end. So the cash rental rates were discussed in that video. What are the pros and cons?
So the good thing about cash rental rates is it gives you a ballpark, somewhere to start, of rates in that particular area. So you can use them to move up or down depending on the specific situation and get that discussion going. Use caution, as they might not take into account issues that affect the rates, such as proximity to highways or roads, the quality of the ground, water. So if it's pasture ground, does it have ponds? Does it have creeks? Are there tanks? What kind of shape are they in? Interior fencing. So there's a lot of items that might not be discussed, or you might not be able to garnish from those rates that go into building them. Also, if rates are moving up rapidly, many rates reported might be negotiated several years ago. Average rates in this case might not be reflecting new current rates.
Okay. What's the difference between the USDA NAS results and the University of Missouri's?
So I get this question all the time, where I actually explain it to people so they understand the difference. NAS, it is put out by the National Agriculture Statistics Service, which is part of the USDA. The good thing about NAS is, one, they publish rates every year in August, so you get a new price list. The second thing is they break it down by county. So you get a Missouri, you can pull up Missouri and break it down by county in non-irrigated cropland, or non-irrigated cropland, irrigated cropland, and then pasture ground. So you get it broke down into those three aspects. The downfall is you don't get any more information. So you don't get the highs and the lows. You just get an average. Remember, 1 foot in a hot bucket, 1 foot in a cold bucket. The University of Missouri, on the other hand, puts out new rates every 3 years. The benefit is you get the low, mid, and high range in rates, and also the production. So what's the yield on crop ground? Is that ground carrying two pairs? Is it carrying 4 pairs? There's a little bit more that goes into it that you can get out of it. NAS rates are often lower due to how the surveys are done. NAS asks for a rate for a piece of ground divided by the acres. It does not take into account the unusable ground. MU asks for what was paid per acre, so not how much for the whole field. So MU takes into account that unusable ground. Between the surveys, the return percent, landowners and tenants can get a pretty good ballpark and to really begin to hone in on a good rental rate on those negotiations.
Well, the video mentioned budgets to calculate rent. So if a tenant wants to start a budget for lease ground, who do they go to? And is this only for crop ground?
So no, what I would encourage anyone to do is go visit their local extension office and inquire who their local ag business specialist is covering their area. I would also then, cash rental rates, they're not just for crops, but they are also for hay and pasture ground too. In addition to crop budgets, MU has budgets for hay, pasture, and a multitude of different things out there. So whatever you're looking for a budget on, MU probably has it. From there, you can take those budgets and modify them to a particular rental situation or your farming style. Many different extensions have resources in Excel to easily run calculations. If one extension center's budget isn't making sense, go to good old Google and type in that budget and type an extension behind it. More than likely, another state will have it. Pull it up, and that will help maybe make more sense to you than another one.
Right. And you had a disclaimer.
Correct. So just remember, folks, that this is an educational series and not to be taken as legal advice. Always consult with your insurance agent or lawyer for specific questions. And I always encourage people to reach out to their lawyer, insurance agent, whoever, get their questions answered beforehand, get items ironed out, because that will make situations less painless and hopefully easier to negotiate.
Excellent. Great information. We have reached the question and answer portion of our webinar. And the first question is, the video talked about the landowner having specific objectives. How is the tenant supposed to know what the landowner's objectives are?
So that's a great question. What I would encourage people to do is have a good old conversation, something no one really likes to have nowadays. How do you best communicate to that landowner? Is it when they're out? Is it via email? Is it via text? So start reaching out, asking, do you have any objectives? Would you like to see me change anything? What's your long-term plans? That way you can start working your goals and their goals to be the same and really get along better with your landlord and hopefully them along with you. Get these situations ironed out so that you've got that ground locked in long-term.
Great. Next question. Are tenant insurance requirements commonly written directly into the lease, coverage options, amounts?
So what I would say to this, if you want this to be written in, have it written in. It is not a bad clause at all to have this required in the lease document that the tenant carry insurance. Now, regarding specific coverage amounts or options, this is going to be between you and that tenant, and everyone's situation is different. So what one tenant needs is different than what another tenant needs. And same thing with landowners. Their farming operations are going to be different. Their liability amounts are going to be different. So that's going to be one of those conversations that you have to have with them to figure out what their needs are and what they can do. They might not be able to afford a super high policy and they might not need a super high policy, but work that out beforehand.
Very good. Any advice on approaching a landowner on how to negotiate those non-cash items into the following year's rent?
Yep. So start that conversation very early. Start that out. List the items that you would be willing to do for non-cash compensation. Get a pen and paper, list them out, and then how much is it going to cost you in time? What do you value your time at? What do you value your equipment at? And go at it like that. And then sit down with that landowner, present to them, this is what I'm willing to do. Maybe in knocking X amount off, I'm willing to provide this amount, and this will help your ground in this way. Yes, you might not be getting cash, but I'm helping to maintain the property value of your ground.
Excellent. We have another question in the chat. I've only ever had insurance for a house. Are there special insurance companies that focus on ag insurance, or do most insurance companies cover ag?
So this is something where you need to reach out to your specific insurance carrier on. A lot of companies, they do have ag policies. So go talk to your agent. The issue might be is the agent doesn't write those policies and you have to go to a different agent for that. I'm not going to name specific insurance carriers because then you get into supporting some and not supporting others and people get grumpy over that. But most insurance companies have in ag policies. Some are better than others. So if you are in the market for one, start shopping around. And see what you can find. And you might ask that agent if they have worked on ag policies before, and then start comparing them. Do not be afraid to walk in there and compare policies. I've done it with ours. Comparing policies, ask detailed questions, what they cover, what they don't. Why is this liability here and not here? Ask those questions, talk to your agent. Do not be afraid to ask those questions.
And here's a question that might be very helpful to a lot of folks. Where can people go to print cash lease contracts?
So where we pull them from is called Ag Lease 101. And this is a great resource to use, aglease101.org, I believe it's going to be put up there. And they've got everything from cash leases to livestock leases to pasture leases and everything in between. So go there, You can print them off. If you don't need a section, you can scratch through it. You can even get it notarized if you want to, and it provides all the documents that you need for a good cash lease. And in there too, you can add additional agreements.
Great. We do have another question. How do you know if you have good, average, or poor pasture land for setting a rate? This is coming from someone with an inherited farm and lease agreement and zero experience.
So what you can do is first reach out to your local agronomist, get them out, have a pasture walk done with them, see what they say, and then start gathering information. If that ground is producing hay, how much hay is it producing? What's the tonnage done each year? How many cows are you running? Do you have a lot of weeds out there? Is the ground real rocky? What do the soil surveys say that come from USDA? So don't be afraid to reach out to your local NRCS office to get resources, figuring out how good your ground is. Don't be afraid to reach out to your local agronomist to help determine how good your ground is, and start building it like that. You can get ideas by looking at your ground, looking at others. But even in our area, there's some not too far apart, some grounds much better than others. But no, start reaching out to many different folks to start building that knowledge.
Well, this has been all right. Thank you so much for your questions, everyone. And Rachel is, if you have any follow-up questions or want to reach out and have some discussions with her further, she is going to give us we're going to have it in the chat. There it is now. Her email and phone number. Tell us what those are.
Yep. So if anyone needs or wants to reach out to me for further questions or to talk or to chat or whatever, go over specific situations, don't be afraid to reach out. My office number is 573-438-2671. However, I am on the road quite a bit, so you can always call the office. They'll forward the call to me. It might be a couple days before I get back to you, but I always try to, or I'll leave voicemails. Or don't be afraid to shoot me an email, and then we can set up a time to talk. My email is hopkinsrm@umsystem.edu.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing all this great information.
Well, thanks for having me, Julie.
My pleasure. And thank you all for joining us yet again. A week from this evening, we will have David Reinbach to talk about share leases. Have a good evening.